a hairdo. I was crouched in my chair wearing jeans and sporting messy paint-spattered hair. But I knew her all right. I sure did. She was exactly like me. That same hopeful expression, was this going to be the place that improved things? That ridiculous putting a good face on it determination. This mother holding the pieces of her broken heart in her own hands. An organ busted so recklessly, so raggedly that the shards in turn cut her, the very hands that were holding it together. Oh, I know her. Walking to my car after the meeting, I couldn't remember what there was in the entire world to be amused of. I felt myself harden against the sorrow welling up inside. The sharp little tip of the car door licked the skin of my cheek as I yanked it open. That tiny prick of pain was enough. It tore me apart. I sat in the car and railed at the night sky. Where are you? What are you doing while my son is going mad? Where's my mother? Where's my father? Fuck you, and the big fat faith all of you believers cling to. If it's true, then where the hell are you? I screamed. Where are you? I wiped my cheek with the back of my hand and saw a faint line of blood. My mother told me that my hands were touched by you. That was why I could paint. I go into the colors and the movement, and there I know myself, and there I lose myself, and then there I find myself. So thanks for that, the painting thing. But how about I give that back to you and you give Nick back to me? I'll never paint again. Just please, please give me back my son. The previous week's meeting had been all about violence and the horrible things that mentally ill people sometimes do to others. The data shows that quite often others means mom. I now understand those women who go foolishly into situations of grave danger because they trust their child will know them and would never hurt them. You see it on the news all the time. She thinks, he'll come to his senses. He'll look into my eyes and he will stop. We don't believe that they will ever harm us. And then out comes the gun, the knife, the icy clench of strong fingers around the throat, and it's too late. Not the most upbeat portion, but I figured it gave a good overview.
So good. Well, Mimi came to me thinking about this book, and she was unaware that I am from a family also with schizophrenia. And I thought she was a painter and she wanted to write a book about her experience with Nick and with, it's an odyssey, it's an odyssey and you're in there with the monsters and things swirling around and then to read the book, I was kind of afraid to read it because my family's been through many of these experiences and expecting, I would have to go to Costco and get a raft of Kleenex. Instead, I found a book that reads like a suspense thriller. The pace and the writing is so beautiful. It was something I didn't expect, was a transformation into a writer. To tell the story. So can you talk a little bit about your journey trying to tell the story?
Yeah, I always had a bit of a knack for writing, and I wrote stories when I was in college, but nothing ever really competed with painting until all of this happened. And I wanted to put something out in the world that people could really get their teeth into, where there was no room for interpretation, where it was the story. And it really felt to me that the only way to do that was with words. So the good thing about being a painter for 50 years is you learn how to self-start and you learn how to sustain your own work. So that part of it wasn't hard. And that's usually something that I think is hard for writers. I just went into, my husband said to me one winter 4 years ago, well, why don't you just go in the room and write the book already? And I said, I'm going to do that. And I would get up every morning and I would write for 8 hours every day. And I would just sit down and write, and I was just it was just pouring out, and I was kind of mining my memory for details. And what I remembered, I was a little bit afraid I wouldn't remember things. But as I started writing, more and more came back to me. So then as I would think of something, I would jot it down on Post-its. And then at the end of the day, I would arrange all the Post-its on the wall. And by the end of, the first week or two, it looked like, excuse the comparison, but John Nash's workroom in A Beautiful Mind. If you recall that movie, that room, it had all this stuff on the walls. That's what and so I did it in a very visual way. I had color coding and, and I moved things around, and I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And at the end of many, many months, I thought I had written a book. And at that point, I edited it with two friends of mine who are screenwriters, and they went through it with me. And then I still thought I had a book. And then I hired, thanks to you, the extraordinary and brilliant Samantha Dunn to read and edit and work with me. And she informed me that it was all very nice and good, but it wasn't anything resembling a book. And so then at that late date, after a year of working on it, she sat down and on a napkin at Starbucks drew me a chart of a through line and an arc, and how you structure a story. I had no idea. It's not something I'd ever done. So then I started to take it apart and put it back together and regard it more the way I regard a painting, with structure and nuance and moving it around and what needs to be there and what doesn't need to be there. And I think then I edited a whole nother time, and then I workshopped it with Lydia Yuknovich for 24 weeks up in Washington with an extraordinary writing group. And after that, I finally felt like, okay, I can see this thing from outer space now. I know what's in there. In the beginning, in the first year or so, I didn't even really know what was in it. It was so many words and so many pages, but it was a phenomenal experience, and not unlike painting.
And did it help you see your own situation differently?
Yes, it was definitely a transmigration, the entire book. I started out thinking I was going to write almost a kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of thing of just, the wacky, wild story. That quickly became clearly not my purpose. But I did keep, I do feel that there's a lot of humor in it, and that's because that was a big component for us. But it's really brought me to a place of peace and acceptance with what's happened. I mean, I still have my moments of howling at the moon, but I allow those because it's called for. But yeah, it helped me really process things, and it helped me also see it from the different points of view and understand what my daughters went through, and also understand what Craig went through. That was a big part of it too. When I first wrote the book, one of the things that Samantha said to me when we first met is, "Where's your husband? Do you even have a husband? He's not even in this book. You can't write this book and not have that relationship in there." But it was so difficult and fraught and hard to approach. And it helped us work through it. What I did after that is I sat him down and I interviewed him. I said, "It's not me talking to you. I'm an interviewer. I'm going to ask you questions. We don't have to be defensive. We don't have to be anything. I need to understand what you went through." And I have an hour and a half interview I did of him. And then I listened to that and I learned, and I put myself more into his shoes.
Isn't that interesting? Because you live through it together, but every family member has their own experience. It's a family illness. It's not just we think of, my brother, it has schizophrenia, your son has schizophrenia, it's his illness, but everybody in the family, right, has their own relationship.
Yeah. And when I really had it to the point where we were going to start sending it out, I had each member of the family read it. Not Nick, because he doesn't really read a book, but he knows about it. But, and I said, you know, because it's quite revealing and there's a lot of personal stuff. And I felt ethically, I needed to make sure it was okay with everybody. And everybody was fine. And one of the most moving things to me is when I talked to Rose, my youngest, she said to me, you know, there are things in here that are not how I remember them. But this is your telling of the story, and this is your perception of the story. So go for it. And I was so gratified that everybody just said, do what you need to do.
It's so interesting that you interviewed your husband. You know, you were side by side, but when something super traumatic happens, you know, everybody kind of hits the bunkers.
Yes, and you know, when we were going through it, there was so much tumult and so much trauma, and it was so painful that when Craig and I would talk about it, the pain would grow so exponentially that for years, we only talked about it in the most practical ways. We didn't talk about how we felt. You know, there are a few times, and they're in the book, but there are things, but really for many years, it's really only in the last years that we can actually sit and talk about it and process the experience together. It took a long time to get to that.
Yeah, and getting to know each other differently, very differently.
Yeah. Yes.
What was the best advice you got early on when, after Nick had had his break and was starting to go downhill? There's a wonderful piece in the book. Shall I just read it?
The towel lady?
Yeah. Yeah. Tell the story and I'll read the piece.
Well, we were in, this was Nick's first hospitalization, and Lucy and I had brought him to Kaiser, and we were in the emergency room, and he was, I think he was bound to the bed. I think they tied his arms to the bed, and I just lost it. You know, I'm the Energizer Bunny, and I can handle any situation. You know, every time I open my mouth, I just burst into tears, and Lucy had to navigate everything for me. And I spent most of the time just bursting into tears. And at one point I was walking down the hall and this woman pulled me.
Yes, and this lady with the towel cart, she says, because you're sitting in the janitor's closet.
Like, she pulled me from the hallway, turned over a bucket and said, sit down.
Listen to me, I want to tell you something, she said, this lady pushing the towel cart, looking straight at me. My husband is sick like your son. He has the same thing. It's terrible. Those doctors are bastards. They think they're gods. Oh, I've been through this. The nurses, they're so overworked they can hardly help. You got to be strong, Mija. You are the mother. Don't let them push you around. I know you want to just cry forever, but you can't. She put her ample arms around me and held me while I sobbed. Then she pulled away and said, this isn't going to go away. This is really early, right? Oh, this is it. This is it now. Don't waste time wishing it wasn't true. She held both my hands in hers for just a second and then left.
Yeah, you know, there's a postscript to that too, because there's a second part that was the real signed, sealed, and delivered of that message. And that was later, when we'd already, you know, gone down the drain as a family and we were all out of control. I used to try and keep it together during the day. I had a business to run. I had, you know, a life. I had 2 younger girls at home. And so I would pretend that everything was fine. And then I would go at night when everybody had settled down, I would go in the bathroom and I would run the shower and I would lie on the cold tile floor and I would cry. And I thought I was doing such a good job of hiding it. Obviously, now I know I wasn't anyway. And that would be a piece of advice I would give other parents is don't pretend, don't try and hide it. Everybody knows anyway. But I came out of the bathroom and I was crying and there was Lucy. And she said to me, Mom, why are you crying? And I said, well, I'm busted. I better just be honest. And I said, well, I'm crying because I miss your brother. And she said, what do you mean you miss my brother? Nick's not gone. Nick's here. And I looked at her and I said, yeah, but he's not who he was supposed to be. And she looked right back at me and she said, yeah, he is. It's just not what you thought. And she waltzed off and I popped down in the window seat and I, sat there like I had been hit with an anvil. And that was really the turning point for me. And, that was a good 12 years ago. I still have to go back to that moment sometimes to remind myself that this is who he is. This is how he came to us, and hence the title. And just because I had an idea of what his life was going to be like, and just because I had it all mapped out in my head, that doesn't mean that's how it was supposed to be. This is who he is. This is how he came to us. And I am his mother, and I will be his mother in whatever condition and iteration he finds himself. And it helps me. And from the mouths of babes.
And that's really the journey, right, of the book. That's really the journey that the book describes. Is it takes that long to shift from, this is who he was supposed to be. What about the golden future? What about the wife and the career? And, he was a brilliant person, right?
Yes.
A very talented, charismatic person. So, as the mother, you're envisioning this elaborate future. And then
it's hard to let go of. I got to tell you, I still lay in bed some nights and fantasize about it being different. It's just, you grow them in your belly. You've got these 9 months. You're madly in love with them from the moment you know they exist. It's very hard to let go of how you thought things were supposed to be. But I was asked recently in an interview, what am I most proud of? Intimation being, I'm the super mom. What am I so proud of? And I said to him, I'm not really proud of anything. Yeah, I'm a good mother, but I think that's the baseline. You bring a kid into the world, the least you can be is a good mother. And so I'm not proud of anything. I've just done my job. But what I am proud of, and what does bring me comfort, is the fact that, you say he was so talented and charming and brilliant. And you know what, Janet, he still is. It's still there. You just have to know the language. And the thing that gives me comfort is schizophrenia is arguably the worst of the mental illnesses, or as bad as it gets. And it manifests and presents itself in ways that are ugly and frightening and horrifying and violent. And my son is a human being of such intrinsic goodness that even schizophrenia could not touch that. He is still sweet and a good person and has empathy, which is something that disappears with schizophrenia. And that's what I'm proud of. I'm proud of who he is, and I'm proud of the fact that even schizophrenia couldn't take that away.
Yeah, and sometimes the hard life, develops that more empathy, because they live a very hard life.
Yeah.
I thought that, so what's the, let's see, there is you have a strong drive to fix things. You're very physical, you're very able to jump in and deal with the practicalities. So how did that work for you and work against you?
Well, it worked for me in that it's a terribly difficult road, as you know. And I'm strong, and I'm kind of a pit bull, and I have a lot of stamina. And it worked well for me that way, in terms of functionality and in terms of being able to advocate and being able to get things done. It didn't serve me internally. It didn't serve me emotionally and psychically, because I didn't really let myself feel the feelings. I didn't process them. I didn't understand them. I was just in crisis mode all the time. And I also was so convinced that if I just tried hard enough, I would be able to fix this, that I wasted a lot of energy. And one of the things, besides my daughter's wise words, that really helped me was I fell into doing yoga and meditation, which is also something that was not my style at all, but I just sort of tumbled into it. And you know, I would go to the classes for the exercise, and the girls would be talking about the yogic philosophy and the sutras, and I'd have a running dialogue of jokes going in my head. But as time went by, it started getting in. And the lesson that I learned, and the thing that changed the way I live in the world, is the idea of acceptance, the idea of surrender. You know, being type A personality, pit bull, the idea of surrender was something, well, surrender equals failure. Surrender equals losing the war. And I learned a whole different definition of surrender and acceptance that involves strength and intelligence, because there's really nothing brilliant or heroic about throwing yourself against a brick wall over and over again until you're black and blue. And that was what I was doing. And what took strength was to stand in my own footsteps and say, this is what it is, and this is who he is, and this is what I have to deal with, and I'm going to stop trying to change it. I'm going to be able to allow for this in my life. And that's when things started changing.
Do you think as Americans, we have a harder time with things that are, you know, situations in which we're vulnerable, in which we can't necessarily figure out, you know, some way that works? And
well, I got to tell you, at this particular point in time, I don't even want to open up the can of worms of what it means to be American and what's going on, because I think that you're right. There's a lot of underlying things there. But one thing that I would say, because I mean, I'll just get going and never stop. But one thing that I would say that I do think is different is, I think as contemporary people, as people living in the 21st century, yes. Because if you read about mental illness and you go back and you read about primitive cultures and even not so primitive cultures, and also there's a town in Italy called Trieste, which the whole town centers around being a place where people with serious mental illness are embraced and can live. And it's definitely worth looking into.
Oh,
if
wow.
I had heard about this place further back, I'd probably be in Italy right now, but I only heard about it a couple of years ago. But I think that, you know, I mean, in ancient cultures, people with mental illness were regarded as shamans and you know, soothsayers and people with divine wisdom. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly to be embraced by your culture in that way is a beautiful and inclusive thing. The problem with American culture in the 21st century is that there is nowhere for people with mental illness, with serious mental illness. You know, we emptied out the mental institutions in the 60s, and they were supposed to be replaced by community-based treatment. That never happened.
Reagan,
and the,
miracle.
Yeah, thank you, Ronald Reagan. And the de facto mental health facilities now are the prisons and the streets. So we have a society where there is no place for these people to stand. There's no place for them to live. That's obscene. They have, and this is not something that we need to do for mentally ill people out of the goodness of our hearts. They're human beings. They have a right to a place in this world as much as you or I. And our culture does not have that. We have excluded them. We don't want to look at them. We turn away. We don't look at them on the streets, and we don't think about them in the prisons. And that is wrong. It needs to change.
What's odd, and you talk about this in an early, the meeting that Mimi had gone to, meetings that Mimi had gone to was the NAMI, which is the National Association for Mental Health, mental illness.
Yeah.
And they're like the keys to the kingdom, because nobody tells you this stuff. And they tell Mimi about how the police are, you know, they call it catch and release. You know, I mean, the police are the only way into the mental health system, or what's left of it. You know, your person has to be arrested.
And that is incredibly risky because they often end up dead.
Right, as we've seen.
Yes.
You know, so it becomes a police issue. I know the police they're not social workers. They don't really want to do that either. You know, it's that America, yeah, we're good at what we're good at, and what we can't deal with, we just don't deal with. I mean, what's difficult, we just don't deal with.
Well, I think that's changing. Back to what I wasn't going to talk
I
about.
think it is.
I hope is that it's cracked open somehow. And I feel that the whole mental health, I mean, I'm raring to go now, you know. I feel like there's light. There's light coming in, and these changes, they can be made. It can happen.
I think it's cracked open now. I think that, you know, this idea that maybe the, you know, heavily armed police are not like the first choice for a lot of social ills, you know, that there are other ways. And, you know, and it's not even you know, it's not even something that is an adversarial thing. I don't think the police really want to do it either. You know, I think, you know,
in running
to have those people in prison.
Right. In running interference with the police, when I've had to call them for Nick, I haven't had a bad experience, but I'm very proactive. You know, I get right up there and I tell them the situation, and you know, because there's too many horror stories, but if you don't have somebody advocating for you, you're lost.
Yeah, and not everybody does. So we were going to open it to questions at the 40-minute mark. So anybody who has questions, I'll put it on how do you want to handle the questions?
Yeah, so if you, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a little feature that says raise hand, which you can do that. If you're on video, you can just wave an arm and I'll unmute you. If there's absolute dead silence and you feel brave, you can unmute yourself cautiously and just start. Or put it in the chat if you want me to ask for you.
Yeah, I'll be right back. It's always the thing with the question.
Yeah, go ahead and put them in the chat, and then we can see them right away.
Okay.
Talk about Nick. How is he doing?
Nick is actually doing quite well right now. We had a bad time a couple years ago. He got psychotic. He was in the hospital for a few weeks. It was just awful. But we're doing a medication change right now that I'm very hopeful about. And he's recently started painting again. All these years, he would color in coloring books because he has almost, you know, the physical need to be drawing. But he, I think, couldn't access what it was in his head to think of what to draw, or didn't want to. So he would sit and he would draw in children's coloring books. And he's begun to segue in the last year into doing his own paintings. And now I go over and I set up with him and I paint with him. And that's been really wonderful. So that's a great development. His life is pretty mitigated. You know, he's in his apartment. He has a caregiver who comes to give him his meds. He sees his dad and me. His sisters are unfortunately all far away, although they adore him and he adores them and they're in contact a lot. He doesn't see too many people, but his life is peaceful. And that's good. And we're working on improving the quality of it as well.
Carrie asks, are services in Washington State superior to LA County? What should we be advocating for here?
Yeah, hi, Carrie. I would say yes. They, for us, it's worked out that way. Now, I don't know if what we have up here was available in LA. It certainly was never offered to me. When I came up here, I got him signed up with, for his Social Security and signed up for the local mental health center, which actually is not great because in small towns and rural areas, it's very difficult to get good doctors to come and be here. So the doctor that he sees virtually. But what they do have is great DHS services. So after 10 years of being the one who had to go to his house every day and put on my Nurse Ratched hat and make sure that he swallowed his pills, the caregivers do it. And it's, first of all, very nice not to have to do that just for the quality of my life, but it's also been very good for my relationship with Nick, because it's taken that aspect out of it, and it's more pleasant.
So Elizabeth says, since I met you, Mimi, as a fellow writer and mother of a child with severe disabilities, I've been struck by your dogged energy and ability to cut through and write. Were you ever intimidated by the process
of writing? No, but you know what? I was intimidated by the business of being an author. I had to really school myself on that because I knew nothing, but not the writing, because it's just like painting. I mean, I always say, being a painter is such a stupid thing to be. You're just painting every day. You never get a raise and you never get a promotion, and you have to judge your own work, and you have to decide if you're good or bad or getting better. And, it's just like, it seems like such a folly. And so what's being a writer? It's the same thing. It's so self-sustained. So that was not a hard thing for me. I like to work hard, but I do have to say, Elizabeth, I think that I have worked harder on this book than I've ever worked on anything. Even Craig said to me, he said, I've never seen you work this hard on anything. It's a lot of work.
And then Jack asks, do you think Nick will ever read the book? And if so, how do you think he will react?
Well, Jack, that is something that haunts me. Nick knows about the book, and because I felt that there's some ethical issues here. He knows about the book, and he knows what it's about, and he's very proud and pleased that his artwork is on the cover of it. I don't know that he, in the condition that he's in at this point, has the attention span to actually read a book. The honest truth is, if Nick woke up tomorrow and was no longer had schizophrenia, he would probably not be pleased with me that I revealed so much about him in a book to the world. I have to be honest with myself about that. But if he woke up tomorrow and was better, I'll take it, because he'd be better. So, I figure if that happened, I'll take the heat. And I do think that it's very important that the story be out here, and hopefully one day he will be at a point cognitively and attention span wise where he can read it.
So this feeds into that question from Patricia. At one point, you said you hoped this book would help people. What do you hope will come from it?
Well, it has a few prongs to it. Initially, I wanted to write this story because when the first few years, this was 2004, people are much more open about these things now. I remember sitting in my living room on Norton Avenue, looking out my big glass window and feeling like every other house had this normal, clean, wonderful life. And I had this dirty, scary, horrible thing behind my front door. And I was the only one in the world with that thing. And I was so hungry to just talk to somebody who understood and who got it and who had been through it, to let me know it's not going to kill me, or kill us or destroy us. And there was nothing. And if I'd had this book to pick up, there were books about schizophrenia, but not a sort of like guts and sweat and blood story of, okay, this is what it's really like in the trenches, guys. And you do get through it. And your family does come out in one piece. And you do have love and joy in your life. And so that's a primary thing for the book, is I just want it out there. And I've gotten so many emails and letters and things from people, mothers, saying, oh my God, I felt like I was reading my own story. I haven't had that experience until now. So that's great. And then also I wanted a legacy of and for Nick. I wanted there to be something in the world that showed who he was, who he is, and, a portrait of him, because he's extraordinary. And like I said, he's still extraordinary. You have to know how, you have to meet him where he is. You have to understand his signaling and his language and what means what. But my girls and I, we get it. There's sometimes when Nick will say something to me and I'll call up Lucy or Rose or Scarlett and I'll tell them, oh, this is what Nick said. And it would be something that to somebody else would mean nothing. You know, they wouldn't even understand what it is, and we'll burst into tears or we'll burst out laughing because we can understand his language. And so I wanted that to exist in the world, and I hope that this book does that.
Well, coming through reading it, you know, you know, even that little session with the class where somebody's standing behind you saying all kinds of crazy stuff while you're trying to do something.
Mm.
You read that and you go out and you look at the world and it's like, oh, okay, that's what that person is dealing with. I mean, it really helps open our eyes to how people have to live every day.
Yeah, that was really eye-opening. Yeah.
You know, so here's another question. Carrie says, you need to tell Nick someday it's through these stories that we see the human cost of our, you know, mental health system. You know, I think that they know very well. My brother is in his late 60s and nobody negotiates the system better than he does because he's been in it for 40 years.
And your brother's married now, right?
Well, he's, you know, they lose benefits if they're actually married.
Oh, I see.
So, you know, they can afford to lose anything, you know. So they had a ceremony, you know, they had a private ceremony.
Well, see, that's one of the things that causes me a lot of anguish is the idea that Nick will always be alone. I really, really hope that somehow there's
my brother's been in those board and cares, like the one on Crenshaw that you described. That's where he lives, in those kind of places. And she was just somebody who was also in the place.
Yeah. Well, you know, and I have to say, and this is one of the things that I'm so grateful for too, because when I talk to other moms, you know, this is what every mom agonizes about is what's going to happen when I'm gone. What's going to happen to him when I'm gone? Because nobody's going to take care of him like I am. And, you know, Craig asked me at one point, do you worry about that? And I said, you know, I don't. Because I know that his 3 sisters will take care of him. It's one thing I really don't have to worry about. And what a wonderful thing. I mean, to know that he will always be loved and he will always be cared for.
Right. And families, maybe people don't know this, that families, you know, once the person is in the system, once they have their Social Security, the SSI and their Medi-Cal and Medicare, you know, they can be somewhat independent of you, of the family. Like he didn't live with you. You know, you always had a.
Yeah. Well, you know, when the girls were younger, we had to ban him from the house, which was a horrible thing to have to do to a young, I mean, he was young then, but they were little and they had to have the sanctity of their home. They had to have peace in their home. And now, I think he's happier living on his own, you know, and because he, you know, people with schizophrenia also, you know, back to that thing about the filters and noise and all of that. I mean, he likes to control his environment.
Okay, and we have Stacy asks a really good question about the way the legal and medical system deal with the rights of the mentally ill. Saying it, you know, should it be easier for parents to get an adult child into treatment? You know, there's a lot of weird issues around. These are adult people, but they're not always competent.
This is a very tricky issue, and it's a really important issue. The parents that I know who are parents of, especially certainly adults with schizophrenia, there has to be some sort of caveat. There has to be some sort of opening in the laws so that we can take care of them, because the doctors can't talk to us. We are allowed to talk to the doctors, but it's very hard to get them treatment, and it's very hard to force treatment. And the thing that people have to remember, you know, all of these laws, the HIPAA laws, and even the deinstitutionalization of the mental hospital, it was by good-minded people trying to, you know, with the goodness in their heart. They weren't trying to create a terrible situation, but inadvertently they did. They were trying to protect people's rights, because back in those days, you had a lot of instances of husbands having their wives committed so that they can get them out of the way, or people having their parents committed so that they can get their money, and, you know, all kinds of abuses.
Rebellious children, you know.
Exactly. But the thing that you have to remember when you're thinking of people's civil rights is that when you have schizophrenia, it is your brain that's afflicted. The very organ that will allow you to understand that you are sick is the organ that is sick. And there's a term for that symptom, and it's called anosognosia, and it's the inability to understand that you're ill. So how the hell are you going to go and seek treatment if you don't think anything is wrong with you? And then you have paranoia, and you think that everybody's ganging up on you, and it's an impossible situation. So there has to be a bridge. There has to be a way to get them to a point of lucidity where then they can start to navigate their own lives and make their own decisions. You can't take a person who doesn't understand what's happening and put them at the wheel. That's why you have the disasters that you have.
Okay, here's another one from David. You spoke of your coming to accept the situation as it is. Can you elaborate on Nick's acceptance, or how he feels, or do you talk to him about that?
We do talk. He doesn't like to talk about it much. It's really only in the last few years that he'll even say the word schizophrenia. He just, I don't know if it's denial or it's just he doesn't want to talk about it, but he won't talk about hearing voices. He won't tell me what they're like, but he does now accept and acknowledge that he has the mental illness. But again, it's kind of code. I'll tell you, hi David, by the way, I'll tell you, this is an example. Nick and I were recently, we had gone to Olympia to see his psychiatrist, and we had lunch, and then we were walking downtown afterwards, and there was a guy walking around downtown, obviously either on drugs or in psychosis, screaming at the top of his lungs, and screaming in an awful way. You know what I mean? It wasn't exuberant screaming. It was painful to listen to. And everybody on the street was just kind of walking. It was so odd to be walking next to Nick with somebody doing that. And I just thought, okay, I'm going to try. And I said to him, wow, Nick, look at that guy. What do you think's going on with him? And he said, oh, I think he's probably on SSI. Now, see, that's something that I know my daughters would get, because what the chain of thinking is there is Nick knows he's on SSI, and he gets disability, and that's what he lives off of, and he knows he has that because he has schizophrenia. So he can't say to me he has schizophrenia, I think, but he'll say he must be on SSI. And I said to him, yeah, probably either that or drugs. And then we walked a little farther, and I thought, push my luck a little bit. And so I said to him, were you ever like that? And he said to me, no, not outside. And I said to him, you mean you wouldn't act like that in public? And he went, no. And I said to him, I was afraid to ask, but I said to him, but you sometimes when you were alone, and he nodded in his head, yes, and he looked away. And at that point, it was too much for me. I couldn't talk anymore. But that was a huge breakthrough, to have that conversation. May not seem like much, but that's how we talk about it. We sort of dance around it. But that was big.
It's big when they can accept, when they have an ability to say, yeah, I have this mental illness, because, I mean, nobody wants to be a child their whole lives. And if they can, notice when the voices are getting too loud, or they're starting to feel really crowded, that they can ask for more meds, you
Yes.
know, then you're starting to normal, you know.
Well, that's
live
what we're hoping to move towards with this new medication. It's clozapine, and it's a medication that allows for more insight and approaches it differently than the other medications that mostly blunt them and, you know, that flattening effect. So we're hopeful.
And here's one more from Jacob. From your and Nick's experiences, what would you like mental health providers to know? What can providers do better on an individual and interpersonal level?
Well, I think one is something we've already talked about, is they need to listen to the families and bring the families in, because we're the ones who are there on a day-to-day basis. We're the ones who monitor and see the symptoms and know what's happening. You know, I'll sit with Nick in the doctor's office, and I'm lucky because Nick has signed all the releases and he's fine with me being there. And the doctor will say to him, you know, so are you exercising? Have you been out jogging every day? And Nick will go, yes, I go jogging, and I'll sit behind him. You know, they need to know. Nick will say what he knows that they want to hear, because he wants to please them and he wants to, but you know, I have to sort of mitigate that. But so I think it's very important to listen to the families, but I honestly, the mental health providers, and I've dealt with a lot of them now, I don't have complaints about them. The problem is the system. The system is constructed to make it impossible for everybody, including the doctors. I know that the doctors have the same frustrations and come up against the same walls that I do. The system needs to change.
Yeah, it's, I think that you know, what people don't think about, you know, schizophrenia is not all that common. It's what, 2% of the population, something like that?
1%. But actually, it's a lot of people.
But 1 out of every 3 Americans will suffer from a mental illness in their lifetime.
Yes.
And, you know, by, you know, strengthening the mental health system, everyone is going to benefit.
Very much, you know, and especially now, again, at this particular point in time, the aftermath of what we've been going through in the last few months, and God knows how much longer and what it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of fallout. And we really, really have to start to address this and be pragmatic and be open about it and deal with it, because the problem is shoving it under the carpet.
So, any other questions?
We did it.
Anything you'd like to say about this beautiful book? So Nick did the painting?
Yeah, this is from a drawing, a painting that Nick did when he was about 16. And I was so grateful that the Turner Publishing, they were open to the idea of using it. He's very proud that it's on the cover. And I love it because I feel, you know, it's a kind of a prescient image. It's strong and it represents him.
So Aniko was wondering if you would speak a little more about the system and what needs to be fixed. I mean, what would be the first thing you'd fix?
The very first thing is we need to have mental hospitals. We need to bring them back. I mean, what if we just said, okay, no more cancer hospitals, you know, we'll just deal with it elsewhere. I mean, how can you take a whole portion of the population that has a serious illness and just eliminate the facilities that treat them? Or we'll just have, you know, community-based support groups for people with cancer. They don't really need, you know, the chemotherapy or the scans, or, you know, I mean, it's an absurdity that it doesn't exist. Yes, it was draconian in a lot of ways, and it needs to be revamped, and it needs to be good and helpful and safe, but you don't fix something that's broken by eliminating it. So that would be it. For me, that's the first thing. And then the other thing too is, you know, a bigger view of the system is there needs to be more money for research and medication development for schizophrenia. You know, there hasn't been a new drug for schizophrenia in 35 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's not been a new antipsychotic in 35 years.
And then Gil is asking, what can we do as individuals?
I think that it's like anything else, but it's hard to keep up on everything. But keep your ears open, keep your eyes open. And when you see things on social media or on the news that are about measures or ballot things that are going to help mental illness, get on board and do what you can. I think in the way that you live your life, what I've changed is I look at people and I'm open, and when I see somebody on the street who is clearly mentally ill, I say hello. I look them in the eye. I let them know that they're here in the world with me. And small acts of kindness like that. And again, it's really not kindness, because why the hell shouldn't they be acknowledged? They have as much right to be here as I do. But I think seeing them and talking to them and there's all kinds of social media and campaigns, Bring Change to Mind, which is the organization that I'm on the advisory council of, and there's a lot of campaigns, but just asking people how they are, like really how they are, not just, okay, fine, see you later, but taking the time to be concerned about people's mental health. It's something that we don't really look at or think about. I mean, God knows I didn't really think about it till it, hit home to me.
Yeah, and Elizabeth says, pay attention to caregivers.
Yes, Elizabeth, hi, is a friend of mine, and Elizabeth has a beautiful daughter with a seizure disorder who has to be cared for, and the caregivers, I mean, yeah, me as the mom and the caregiver, and Elizabeth and all of us, people like Elizabeth, this is her life. The rest of her life will be taking care of her daughter. And it's debilitating and it's draining and it takes a lot out of you. And I think, and the people who work as caregivers, same thing. They need to be acknowledged and appreciated. I think there's a whole movement now with the first responders and the nurses and everybody on the front lines. Well, Elizabeth has been on the front lines for 22 years. I've been on the front lines for a while now too. And the people, in my book, in the acknowledgements, I thank at the very end, I thank the caregivers. It's extraordinary human beings who somehow have the capacity to love anybody and everybody and care for them and make it their life's work to wipe their butts and wipe their tears and support me and support Elizabeth. These people are truly angels in my view, and they need to be acknowledged and appreciated.
Well, this was a wonderful,
Thank you for doing this with me, Janet.
wonderful book, and congratulations. Today is the launch day.
Yes, today's the day. And someday in the future, people in LA, we're having a party as soon as we can hug each other again.
Oh my God.
Great. Thank you so much, Janet and Mimi. Again, if you want a copy of the book, we have many in store, and we'd be happy to deliver them curbside, ship them to you. We'll even run them to your house if you ask us nicely. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
All right. And that is it. Good night, everyone.
Good night.